let's get into BAFTAs properly because I think I didn't fully get into it. So it's really that deep was invited to the BAFTAs. Sorry, we got accredited as press to go to the BAFTAs, so I was there. At the start of the ceremony, before the ceremony actually started, Alan Cumming, the host, already told us that John Davidson was in the room. He explained he had Tourette's and said that we might hear sporadic remarks that might be a bit, like shocking. And he asked him to stand up to identify himself in the room, and he did. He was wearing a necklace that kind of represented his condition, I think. And so yeah, and then the ceremony started. So we impressed. We were in a bit of a separate room with like a live feed coming in. So some of the audio wasn't as clear as it was in the room, but we could hear it. And throughout the ceremony, from the beginning, he was ticking vocally from the start of the entire ceremony continuously. And there were many times, including when Delroy Lindo came out with Michael B. Jordan and Wumi Mosaku, and there was a lady who I think she won a film about endometriosis, where it seemed that he had said a very serious slur. But because of the nature of like how we were in the studios, I was like, did he just say what I think he just said? And I wasn't 100% sure, but there was I could feel a gasp in the room. So I strongly suspected, but it wasn't completely actually clear on the spot, not from where we were anyway. And then after it happened, Alan Cumming would come back out and say, yes, you might have heard some remarks. We're sorry about that. And then the event continued. And the ticks kept on happening, and about halfway through they stopped. They didn't announce that he had left the room, but I figured that I thought he had either been asked to leave or he had chosen to leave because it stopped happening. And then later on, his film got some surprise wins. The lead actor from I Swear, who was playing him in the film, won Best Lead Actor over Timothy and Michael B. Jordan and everybody else. And I believe the film also won an award. So that's how it was in the room. Then once the ceremony was over, I started reflecting. I was like, did he say those words I think he said? And I still wasn't 100% sure. But then upon speaking to other people, it was confirmed that, yeah, he definitely said. And because we knew that the whole telecast was on a 1 or 2 hour delay, it didn't even cross my mind for a second that they would actually broadcast it. I was like, well, of course, the whole purpose of having a delay like this is exactly to address a situation like this. So it didn't cross my mind for a moment that the rest of the world was going to hear it. And then, of course, the broadcast happens and it is included. And at the same time, they cut out remarks from some people's speeches, including Akinola Davis Jr., the director of My Father's Shadow, who said Free Congo and Free Palestine at the end of his speech, and they removed that from the BBC telecast. It's worth noting that BAFTAs posted his full acceptance speech immediately it happened on their YouTube. It was BBC that cut it. The entire award ceremony was almost like 3 hours long, and the telecast was always going to be 2 hours long. So we always knew they were going to remove a third of the content they showed from the final telecast. That wasn't a surprise. But of course, the choice of what they choose to remove and what they choose to leave in was always going to be political. Now, in the aftermath, there's been so much that's happened. There's been lots of conversations about basically how unfair it is to put Black people in the middle of their workplace, essentially, in a position of like a violent racial environment. And there's also been conversation about how like these kind of race relations are handled in the UK versus US, and how the UK likes pretending that it's better on race than America. And of course, there's also been a conversation about disability. For this and disability accommodation, for this conversation, because I am not an expert on the actual topics, I've tried my best to lean towards what Black people with Tourette's, how they have addressed the situation. And even amongst them, I think there have been some nuances and not exactly a perfect consensus on how they feel the situation should have been handled. But the main thing I think I have come to a consensus on is definitely that I strongly feel like the BBC failed in duty of care for the Black people in the room, especially Delroy Lindo, Wumi Mosaku, and Michael B. Jordan. I also think they failed John Davidson as well, because I also don't think, and he agrees on this, that even the choices of how they positioned him against the mic, I think they could have perhaps consulted with him more carefully on that. And I think, Dee, you've said to me that they, before the telecast began, before the show began, they could have been a bit more careful in how they were giving people heads up on what could happen that night.
Yeah, sure.
And as for the Akinola speech that they cut, we already know what it is. That's all I'll say about that.
I think the discourse that followed is really unfortunate. I can only imagine what it must have been like to be a Black person with Tourette's watching that discourse. Because on the one hand, you had people basically saying that John meant it, and like it was deliberate, basically, and that's just not how that condition works. But then on the other hand, you had Black people saying that, well, then people with Tourette's need to wear a muzzle and stuff like this. I saw a lot of people actually saying that Black people don't have a right to be upset about what happened, and I don't agree with that either. I think it's just another example of how people really struggle with nuance. A lot of people really struggle with nuance on subjects like this, where it's like neither John and of course not Michael B. Jordan or Delroy Lindo were in the wrong, and I think there's always a knee-jerk reaction to immediately assign that somebody is wrong. So when you don't have a situation like that, it becomes quite tricky. I'm so glad that discourse is gone, but of course it's easy for me to say that I don't have the condition. I'm going to move on with my life now, but what about the people who do have this condition, and also the people that have to be around them, especially in the workplace, you know? So unfortunately, I don't even think this discourse really achieved much, which is the worst thing.
Have you watched I Swear?
I didn't get time to. I actually wanted to, in light of this conversation. Funnily enough, TV introduced me to Tourette's. I was introduced to it through Big Brother, because I used to
Big Brother, was it that guy Pete, the one that won?
Pete
I
Davidson,
remember,
yeah.
I remember.
I used to love Pete.
I remember.
And he would say some crazy
I
shit.
Remember.
He would say some crazy stuff.
I remember his season of Big Brother so well, and it was like a big deal when he won. I remember that very clearly.
Mm-hmm. And I remember that, again, I don't actually know what happened in the house, but from a viewing perspective, I felt like I saw Pete being accommodated quite well. And like, even as a viewer, I remember there was a lot of discourse or like conversation, including from Big Brother, about what does it mean to have Tourette's, and like, why is Pete behaving in this way, and so on. So yeah, it almost feels like we've actually gone backwards.
So in the aftermath of it happening, there was some conversation on basically, do we think it was going to have any impact on the rest of the award season?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it did?
I guess maybe we're going to find out today, isn't it? Potentially. But
I think it perhaps more added a bit more momentum to people understanding kind of how historically unprecedented Sinners is, and Ryan Coogler's accomplishments are, and how, despite all his accomplishments, how easily Black people still continue to be dehumanized in the middle of their workplace in this industry. Mm-hmm. But in terms of actual voting intention, I'm not sure that I see any evidence that it made any significant difference. And I don't think it had enough time to make any significant difference. But we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah,
if MBJ wins tonight, then perhaps not. But even if MBJ wins tonight, I don't even think it's going to be because of the BAFTAs. And I think it's perhaps it's kind of like a bit insulting to him to suggest that.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, in terms of the narrative, it would, like, in terms of how they have campaigned, I do feel like Warner Brothers did not shy away from leaning into it, because the way every day we were waking up with new news that Warner Brothers called up BBC and they told them to edit it immediately. So Warner Brothers was on it. Warner Brothers did this. I was like, yeah. You guys know exactly what you're doing. Like, let's be honest, you're still the same Warner Brothers that was watching as the narratives around Ryan Coogler were so problematic before the film came out. So
And this and nothing.
it's still the same Warner Brothers that is about to allow itself be acquired by Donald Trump's lackey that runs Paramount and about to turn that whole studio into God knows what. So, like, I don't know how seriously I take this idea that they so seriously care about sensitivities for how black filmmakers and creatives are treated.